Hi everyone, my name is Austin Caskey and I am an assistant teaching professor here at Penn State University, and I'm really excited to be sharing sculpting in Blender with you today. I'm going to be taking you through my full workflow, and what we're going to be doing is we're going to be exploring sculpting rocks. This is just a big old rock I went out into my backyard and grabbed. I'd encourage you to go out and find a real rock as well, something you can put your hands on. It's a really fun exercise we're going to be doing. Rocks are a very approachable form, right? But they offer a lot of complexity. You can always sculpt a better rock. So we're going to be doing that today. I'm going to be taking you through the workflow. It's going to be a great opportunity to sort of share every little tip and tidbit I know about sculpting in Blender. And I hope you'll join me because it's really a joy. We'll talk a little bit about how we got started today in just a moment. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is talk to you a little bit about what I'm working with. I'm on a desktop computer, you might be on a laptop, and I've got a couple of things going for me. I've got a 3-button mouse. I won't be using this too much because a lot of what we're going to be doing is going to be working with a tablet. It's important to have a 3-button mouse when working with 3D programs. A lot of your navigation is tied to those. I'm sure that you have gotten that in some other videos on this platform. But if you hold the middle mouse button, you're able to rotate the wheel, the camera. If you hold shift and middle mouse at the same time, you're able to pan, which is really nice for getting your view where you exactly want it. Right click, of course, and left click can be doing different things. It's just generally good to have that all tied to something on a 3-button mouse. So if you are on a laptop or something like that that has a trackpad, there are some options for you. If you come over here and you do Edit, Preferences, and you go to Input and you type Emulate 3-button mouse right here, that'll get you so far when you're doing box modeling. And if you're used to that workflow, great. But for something like sculpting, you're really going to need a tablet or pressure-sensitive device. And I really do recommend getting some sort of tablet. The reason that you're going to want to be doing that, and I'll just say this, I'm using a Huion here. You could be using a Wacom or some other device. Whatever you have, you want to be able to use a pen of some kind. And you want to be able to press down with varying degrees of pressure. And you also ideally want it tracking your stroke a little bit more, in a little bit more of a nuanced way, including like the tilt of the pen and things like that. These sorts of pieces of information are used by the sculpting software here in Blender in order to create an experience that more closely maps manipulating real materials. It's a lot of fun, and if you get everything tuned exactly how you want it, it can sometimes give you the illusion of actually manipulating real form, real material. It's really a blast. So I'm using a Huion tablet. So my driver program might look a little bit different than whatever you're on, but most pressure-sensitive tablets are going to have some sort of driver. A lot of them look somewhat similar to this, and they'll usually have an operation where you come in here and you can see there's actually 2 little buttons on my pen. I can come in here and I can set these up in order to represent different buttons. And if I just click on this, my preference is to have my middle mouse button tied to this first one, and I'm able to set that up as I see fit. I do believe that it is absolutely essential that you tie the middle mouse button to one of these buttons. You need to be able to reach for and move the camera around without having to be locked in to a reaching for the mouse every time that you want to move the camera. That's going to interrupt your sculpting. A lot of what we do in workflow setup is try to get it to be as low friction as possible so that we can get into a flow state when we're sculpting. So however you want to configure it, I do recommend that you put the middle mouse button as an option on one of your buttons for the pen. Some programs will let you do this by application, so if you are savvy enough, you can make it so that button change only affects Blender. It is probably not going to be all that useful to just take you through the Huion version, but it is worth knowing that that option lives up here. Typically, I like having middle mouse for a lot of different reasons, and I don't typically touch that, so cool. So I've gone out and I've got a rock that I'm going to be physically holding and manipulating and working with. But a lot of us are going to be in rooms where maybe the lighting's not so good, and being able to actually like physically touch the thing and like move it around and look at it from different angles, that's really, really, really helpful for when you get lost in reference imagery. But I'm going to recommend that you actually go out and you take some photos of the rock as well. Now, I'm going to be using a software that I'm going to spend a little time introducing. But before I do, I am going to show you this reference software that I've gone ahead and loaded these references in. This is called PureRef. It is a really convenient tool. It's on a pay what you want or will license. So it's extremely low barrier to entry. I would encourage you to check it out. What makes this program special is it has a lot of nifty little features for manipulating reference images. And I find that by having a software like this, it just reduces the amount of friction to actually using reference. If you right click here and you come down here to the modes window, you're able to turn this always on top option on. And what that does is no matter where I'm clicking on my screen, I could completely click out of this software and click over here in Blender, and I'm starting to do some clicking and maybe some work in Blender. You'll notice it doesn't go away. I'm going to turn that mode off for a second so you can see what the default behavior of most software would be. Where's my reference? So hopefully you'll agree that that's an extremely useful operation. You're able to take this window that's extremely resizable, make it fit exactly the part of your screen you need it to. And if you right click, you can move it around. You can resize the window, of course, if you need it to be smaller or bigger. You can then zoom with middle mouse, scroll. Middle mouse click allows you to move things around. Left click allows you to select objects inside of the option. And on top of all of these really handy features, you can right click and you can come down here and find a bunch of different operations that make working with large amounts of reference really, really convenient. This includes, under the Normalize tab, sizing everything so it's roughly the same size. If you have disparate photography from different sources, you may opt to do this. The alignment tools are really, really convenient for just quick grouping. There's a number of options to draw, leave yourself notes, group things so they move together. Really, really handy for laying out large amounts of reference images. And I'm going to say a little bit more about why we're using reference for an object that we actually physically have in front of us in just a second. But I do think that this is going to be a really nice software, not just for this project, but for projects going forward, whether you're working in 2D or 3D. I would really encourage you to check it out. And again, that is PureRef. Quick Google on the internet, you'll find it. All right, so we're gonna get this situated. And I want to just say a little bit about this reference collection. So I'm sculpting here, and being able to physically turn this again, that's nice. For when I'm seeing something in the photos that I'm not necessarily understanding. But I'm kind of in a darker room. A lot of us don't have ideal setups next to our computer for lighting and looking at reference of different scales. And it's really, really important that you consider light when you're looking at reference. Reference can be used for all sorts of things, but one of the primary ways that we see form is through changes in value, right? So if I'm looking at this, obviously because this is all roughly the same value, I can kind of conceptualize it as a facet that's in plane. And you can see, I can really see this form change, the change of direction here. All of that information is purely coming from the values. Color's not really having much to do with it. This is a pretty uniform colored rock. Really what's happening here is light is hitting it and wrapping around it with different levels of intensity for different sides. So this is a really easy thing to do for this project. I'll show you my little setup. It's nothing fancy. I just grabbed a big old sheet of paper. I had some newsprint lying around. You could use literally any solid colored thing. And I draped it so that one half was on the ground, one half was on a wall. And then I shoved a lamp in the face of the rock. And I just took several photos, turning the rock at different angles. And what that allowed me to do is create these reference images that are going to allow me to see different major forms within the rock, right? And it's a little bit clearer to see how I could imagine this form changing just by looking at some of this stuff and like getting a gauge for like, okay, what's happening where, right? Now, I did a little bit of post-processing in Photoshop. I just went in and played with levels. We can look at that in a little bit. But I'll suffice it to say, all I did was I just increased the contrast of the image a little bit on top of that. Now these were just shot with my phone camera. You can see some blurring is happening here along the edges, right? Not ideal, but again, you don't really have to have like a perfect, nice, fancy camera in order to take your own reference images, right? But light has a lot more to do with getting a value out of these. So that's sort of the intentionality behind this sort of two-tiered approach to reference. You know, I could play around with one orientation and move the light instead of the rock. That might also be a good way to get information. But the main thing I'm trying to get is a really sharply lit image so that I can see that form change. And something that can help you kind of understand form change a little bit better. And I'm just going to right click here and I'll come down here to draw, and you'll notice there's a little hotkey for this, Control-Shift-D. Most of the features in PureRef are written right next to them on the menu. And I'm a big believer in not getting overly stuck on hotkeys when you're learning new software. So every time you try to do something the long way, right? Every time I right click and I go try to find draw on the menu, there's just a reminder here, oh, there's a quicker way to do it. Next time you need to reach for this, maybe try to remember it, you know. I don't put too much pressure on myself to do that kind of thing. But a lot of times, again, creative software will, and this is just in general, try to teach you how to use it. And I really, really think it's nice to have that mindset. Sometimes the friction to learning a new software is the hotkeys, and I don't think that needs to be that way. So just changing your attitude can kind of make this a lot more approachable. So if I come down here to draw, I go into a draw mode, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of look at this rock, and I'm going to kind of think about, okay, well, where are the plane changes? And sometimes it can really, really help you to kind of imagine you're doing what's called cross-contour drawing in you know, most drawing classes. Essentially, we're going to imagine we're wrapping a band all the way around, and we're kind of seeing how the surface curvature of this might change a line as it is projected across the surface. So you can kind of see a lot of this is relatively similar in value. I am noticing there's a very subtle change here that's happening. I might zoom in a little bit or make this a little bit larger. There's a little bit of value here that I'm kind of noticing. This is just catching the light a little bit more than this. It's kind of turning in on itself, so that's kind of indicating a crease. But it's a very subtle thing. But just simply the act of going through and going, oh, okay, it's flat, and then there's a little bit of curvature change. And then we're going to have another flat plane going forward. It's kind of very subtly wrapping. And it's not going to really do too much until it hits this point. And I might expect it to have a little upshot. You know, it's kind of catching the light a little bit there. So a little bump there, and then it's wrapping around. And then I'm just gonna move this around. It's gonna come back down and it's gonna go this way around the form. You'll notice I'm kind of pointing to and trying to really find where are these big plane changes, right? And this is just sort of a preparatory drawing stage for this. I'm just looking at the reference and I'm kind of gauging, well, how would a line crossing this surface really change? So flat, a little bit of a curve right there. This is actually catching this plane, and then it's kind of turning down. And then I'm seeing a bit of a plane change here and then here as it wraps back around. And I'm kind of imagining almost like if I had a little rubber band or something that I'm putting down, I'm just imagining that going all the way around what I can see, and it's flush to that rock surface. And this is kind of a nice way to kind of analyze your reference, and it's a lot of the information that we're getting out of those value changes. And some of these are pretty subtle, right? They're not things that I would maybe pick up on if I hadn't had a harsher sort of lighting setup, right? Now, it's not an essential step that you do this or anything, but it can be really useful to getting a better understanding of what you're doing. Now, obviously, I've just gone horizontally. We can also go vertically. This rock's not so interesting vertically. I will say that there's a plane here, and then we're going to go down, and then I kind of see a bit of a plane change happening here, and then you'll notice there's a bit of a lip that's happening here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit closer so you can see exactly what I'm talking about. You can kind of see now that I've zoomed in a little bit more, this is all relatively the same value, and then suddenly we're in an area with a little bit less value, and I'm kind of guessing at what the topology is going to look like, or what that surface looks like. I'm seeing that change in value as the lip of that turning in, right? Now, I'm obviously taking educated guesses here, right? These angles that I'm putting down, they're a little bit meaningless, right? But as an artist, it's useful to be able to track places of change that you can then, build landmarks out of, right? And I think doing this at times will give you a better feeling for the form of an object, right? So I'm going to do another one, and I'm going to make my reference a lot bigger and really zoom in on it and make sure that you can kind of see my decision-making process. So, I'm not necessarily worrying about all these little bumps. I'm looking for major changes in shape and plane, right? And one of the reasons I'm doing that is I'm kind of trying to filter out information that's not going to help me with the first stage of sculpting. You're going to see this a lot in this exercise. A lot of times as sculptors, we are going to be working with primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of information. We give them these names to kind of indicate how important they are for reading the form. You can kind of imagine primary being anything that you could see at a pretty good, reasonable distance, right? And it's sort of the stuff that defines the major silhouettes of the form. If you really simplified this rock, and you still wanted to represent this rock specifically, how would you do that? Secondary tends to be information that's on the larger side, but non-essential to the silhouette or the major planes of the rock, right? Stuff like this crack is kind of on the threshold of secondary, right? It's a bit of bigger information. It kind of helps reinforce the form. Being a project where you're looking at kind of relatively noisy objects like rocks, it's sometimes hard to pull out those secondary forms, but I would pull that out as a secondary form. And then some of the most obvious examples of that tertiary level are the really small pieces of information, the pores of this rock, the cracks, something like this I would put into that tertiary form, right? Actually, maybe that's a secondary. That's on the line for me. And these are kind of arbitrary buckets, but they give you some strategy and indicate like when you might start approaching different features and how you might start approaching different features. So we're going to take you through each of these different stages today. It's going to be a bit of a long video, but it's going to be worth it. So here we're going to come over here, and I'm just going to draw my little line down. I'm going to go boop. I'm seeing a bit of a plane change here. It's very subtle, but I'm going to go boop. This is secondary information. I'm going to skip it, but I'm going to note that it maybe kicks out a little bit. And then there's a bit of a plane change here. Maybe I'll change the color just so I can kind of indicate where that plane change is. I chose a very rock-colored color. Let me change that. Draw that down. Boom. And then we're going to keep looking at the rest of it. And we're going to start to notice that this starts wrapping around and down. And I'm just going to pull this down. And then I'm seeing a very smooth falling under. Unlike over here, this transitions on the softer side. And I'm just going to represent that by kind of curving line. And that's something that you'll notice by doing this exercise of taking a reference photo and kind of wrapping it with these bands, these cross contours. You're going to appreciate when is that change in curvature sharp and when is it more smooth and subtle, right? Are there moments where there's maybe S-curves in the form, right? And as sculptors who want to have a good control of the surface, we will sometimes idealize form. And what that looks like is taking some of these changes of plane and being sensitive to how they transition, being mindful of that. And that's sort of a art for artists decision, different people will be looking to achieve different looks. So the degree to which you indulge yourself doing that will affect the outcome of the results. But a lot of times we find things like S-curves and C-curves and sharp, clearly defined transitions as being very, very appealing, as opposed to something that's a little bit noisier, right? Noise is, of course, something we'll introduce, but as a sculptor, you want to be in control of noise. You don't want to let noise boss you around too much. All right, so I've just been doing a bunch of drawing. I'm going to hit X, and if I want that drawing to, not fall behind the image, if I were to click on this image right now, like the image would come forward and the drawings would be behind it, but kind of stuck there. I'm just going to go ahead and mouse and grab all of them, and I'm going to right-click, and I'm going to do a group command. And that lives in images. Most of what I do here, well, I'm just going to leave it alone. Sometimes I'll say, oh, actually it's hierarchy. There it is. Right click, hierarchy. Nope, that's not it. Is it hierarchy? Yeah, okay, so here's my drawing. Here's my other drawings. And I'm going to throw that drawing into, I believe this is called Rock 1. So it's grouped with Rock 1 now. So this just allowed me to work with a hierarchy here. You can see all of my photos are exposed in a hierarchy. Hierarchy is a very common software organization tool. Blender works with a hierarchy. I'll just highlight that real quick. This is the hierarchy over here in Blender, right? So if you're at all familiar with the hierarchy in Blender, you'll be familiar with the hierarchy in PureRef. Again, it's always important that you make connections between things. Now I've grouped those two things, so if I move them around, you can see I had a drawing earlier here. They'll move together, right? Which is very, very convenient. I'm going to right click, I'm going to turn hierarchy off for now. There is one other type of drawing that you can do in order to extract information from reference, and I apologize for spending so long on this, but I think this is an essential sort of conceptual way of thinking about how we manipulate form here. So I'm going to make another little drawing here on this rock, and I'm going to use green as my color. And this time, instead of wrapping bands around the form, what I want to do is I want to go in here and I want to find where are the plane changes in my rock that make it distinct surfaces. We mentioned before this kind of curvature where it's kind of smoothly moving under the form, things like that. We're trying to be a little bit more sharp with everything. So even if it is on the smoother side, we're going to make a decision about where that plane change starts, where it ends, and we're going to be kind of on the harsher side. And the idea being that if we can identify where these things are, we can go back in and then find the smoothly curving bits and intentionally add that sort of curvature to it back at the end. But a lot of what we're after as sculptors, especially at the primary sculpting stage, is we're trying to find major plane changes, things that affect that primary form. And we'll do this several times, moving through the different stages of the sculpting process. So I'm going to come down here, and I'm just going to look at this rock, and I'm going to say, okay, well, there's a clear area of value for me. It is smoothly kind of transitioning to that next form there, but I'm going to draw that line right there. I'm going to boop, 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 and boop, boop. And I'm just kind of thinking about, like, okay, well, how do these things break up? There's a little bit of a bevel thing that happens here at this edge. I'm just going to represent that with several forms. It's not the cleanest plane breakdown I've ever done. I'm going to be a little bit less aggressive. But what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to isolate, okay, well, if I have to go in here and lay everything out as flat planes in order to help find this stuff, how would I do that, right? And so hopefully you can kind of see the value in this. Again, it's just another conceptual lens, and I could do this on the exact same rock I did up there with the curvature. In fact, sometimes doing both of these can be really, really useful. So having this done and then doing another cross contour right on top of this drawing can be really, really useful. And something I can do now, once I have these drawings, is I can turn them on and off, and you know, a lot of times I want to not be looking at this drawing. I want to be looking at my reference a little bit closer. So if it's obscuring my drawing, that's not good. I don't want that. But I will say, going through this process, you know, it puts it in your head. It gets you in the right headspace. You might notice things in the reference that you didn't notice if you were not doing active observation, right? And this is what I'm encouraging you to do, is to perform an active observation. If you've ever seen people, you know, who are reading books and they're writing in the books, which I really hate it when I buy a used book and I find those, but you know, we're not going to bother anyone drawing on a reference here. People do that in order to get more out of the text. This is sort of a similar mindset. We're being very intentional with how we're approaching our reference, and I wouldn't, you know, spend an overly large amount of time doing this stuff, but again, like, half of art is looking, observing, studying, and then executing. So hopefully you get the idea for how you might take advantage of something like this. And again, if I hit X here, close my drawing program, or drawing part of the Pure Ref program out, and I want to go to hierarchy, again, hotkey is Control J. I'm going to take that drawing that I just did, I'm going to attach it to, which rock is that? They're all the same rock, I just named them rock 1, rock 2, rock 3. So I'm going to tie those together, and you know, I can come in here and I can hide that drawing if I need to. I'm going to just leave it there for now. Cool. And I'm going to hit Control J, and I'm going to make my reference window a reasonable size again. I'm just, you know, resizing window as you would most pieces of software on your computer by clicking on the edges, moving it into position. Alright, so we've done a lot of work already, and we're not even sculpting yet. We haven't even talked about sculpting. And I think that's great, you know. So I'm going to move this off to the side for now. I have a second monitor over here, but I'll be bringing it back when we actually get into sculpting mode. But I want to spend a little time talking about interface. So I am going to be expecting that you have gotten some experience in Blender. I'm going to be expecting that you understand some of the interface stuff. Right now this is the 3D viewport, this is the inspector, this is that hierarchy that we mentioned, this is the toolbar. If you want that to hide or go away, you can hit T. I've got my screen keys casting down here so you can just see I hit T. I'm going to hit T again, right there, boom. So if you get lost or I'm moving too fast or there's a hotkey that I somehow slip up and miss, just be looking for this. I'll be making sure that's on. Now, a lot of times when we're sculpting, we want to be working on meshes that, you know, we're going to try to basically make a mesh that's closer to what we imagine the primary shapes of our object being. I do tend to think of rocks as kind of cube shaped, so we could do a little bit of box modeling and get this a little bit closer to what we're ultimately going to do. But as we're moving in and getting set up, I do kind of just want to show you some things. And I tend to start most sculpts with a sphere. So I'm going to go ahead and just hit A to select all. I do like to point out, if you come up here, a lot of the functionality we have is available to us through these 4 menus right here in object mode. You'll notice I've got to go to select, which is where you'd expect most select commands to live. The first one is all. And just like PureF, oh, look at that. It's listing the hotkey right there, right? So if I hit A for all, and I want to delete it, I'm going to hit X. So I'm going to hit X and delete those objects. Again, delete lives here in object, all the way down here, right? So again, if you have trouble finding an operation that I do, this is something I try to drill into students. Most all of the functionality lives up here in these menus, and the hotkeys are really just exposing faster ways to get to these functions, right? And it is worth knowing that we're going to be stepping through different modes of things, so this will change when we have something selected. But the first thing we're going to do is we're going to come over here to add. If I let my mouse linger over that button, you'll notice that the hotkey for the add menu here is Shift A. If I click it, you can see there's a bunch of options. But let's use that hotkey we just found. I'm going to hit Shift A. Notice there's Shift A down there. And I'm going to find Mesh UV Sphere. Boom. Just added another object to my scene. Looks great. I'm middle mousing around and looking at it. It's looking good. This is what I'm going to be using to sculpt and do some demo sculpting on. And there's a couple other things that we're going to do in order to get into our full sculpting setup. So if you've worked in other creative software like Photoshop or most programs will have something like this where there's different workspace modes. You know, because this is a modular program, I can click on windows and move things around. I can change what this window is functionally, you know, by clicking here, and there's a bunch of functionality built into Blender. Because I am able to rearrange these things and pull new ones out, I might expect that certain parts of my workflow, I would need this all to be arranged in a certain way, right? And because there's different needs for different parts of the workflow, it's nice to be able to have one button that you click that makes all of the windows arranged exactly how you want them, so I don't have to pull this out and change it into whatever I need to do like a UV editing operation. You know? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come over here to sculpting, and I'm going to click that. And that is just a workspace. As I mentioned, all it did is it changed it so that I just have one big old window. That's usually what we want when we're sculpting. And then it added this asset browser down here. And these are different assets or brushes that I have access to when I'm sculpting. We'll talk more about which ones I tend to like to use to solve different problems in a moment. And you'll see that I have a toolbar here. It's got some different features on it than it did before, right? Part of it is we've also gone into sculpt mode. That's part of why those tools on that toolbar look different. We're in sculpt mode. If I click on this, you can see by default we're typically in object mode. Now you might see me a number of times switch between these really, really quickly. And that's because I like to use something called a pie menu when I do this. I'm holding the button tab right now. And before I go too much further, I'm going to make sure that my screencast keys are on. You don't necessarily have to worry about how I'm doing this. This is a add-on that I've noticed sometimes breaks down when you switch workspaces. It's a great add-on. It's how I'm keeping track of things, and maybe I'll make my font a little bit bigger if I can. I apologize, this is I like the position. Font size, there it is. I'm just gonna make that a little bit bigger so it's a little more legible. Let me just see. That's pretty good, and I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger. Yeah. Cool. Now this is just an add-on that I have on. You actually can install this yourself if you're interested in checking out the screencast keys. But if we go over here to edit preferences, I'm going to come down here. By the way, this is add-ons. This is where you, like, literally looking up screencast keys will allow you to pull this up, right, and enable it, right. But if I come over here to key map and I want to use this tab for pie menu option, which I highly recommend. It'll make you a lot faster. This is the button right here, tab for pie menu. And that allows you to take your tab, which normally you just tap it and it switches between object and edit mode. That allows you to now hold it and it opens up this pie menu. And if you've never used a pie menu before, essentially what a pie menu allows you to do is it allows you to hold your mouse over an option and release, and you enter that option. So you'll notice that we're now in object mode. I hold tab, I'm going to flick it down, and I'm in sculpt mode. So what you can do, and what makes it so fast, is once you memorize the angle that you need to go into a certain mode, you can literally just hold tab and flick, and it becomes a very quick motion that's very fun to do, frankly. Again, it's just about reducing friction and making your work life, or your workflow, as easy as possible. Cool. So I really genuinely enjoy having these options available to me. I'm going to do a couple of other things in this sculpting workflow in order to get fully set up before we start walking through a bunch of different brush options. Now, I like to come over here, and when I'm in a new mode, if you haven't been in sculpt mode before, I always like to come over here and look at what are my options, right? If I click on sculpt, that's a new menu of things that I didn't have before. And you might not understand all of the language that's in here. Like, really, what does rebuilding BVH do, right? But this is a jumping off point in order to learn a little bit more about the software. And we're not necessarily going to explicitly talk about this right now, but you know, it's worth understanding, like, okay, well, how does expand mask by topology work, right? You're not going to break anything, so I would encourage you to come in here and experiment and just figure out what these things are. If they have hotkeys attached to them, you're likely expected to use them quite a bit. And you know, if you end up finding an option here that you like, what's nice about Blender is you're able to configure this in order to have different options. Now, if I come over here, I'm going to show you a couple of things I like to do. One of the operations I use a lot in quick succession is a lot of times I'll be putting a mask down. We'll talk more about why and how and all of that later, but follow along with me for now, and we'll get some of these things set up. I use this invert mask option all of the time. And you'll see it even has a hotkey, Control-I. But I like to kind of clump things I'm using very commonly together under one hotkey. And Blender exposes this functionality to us in the form of a quick favorites menu. So if I right click on my invert mask, I'm going to have to hit remove so that my menu looks like yours because I already had it on my quick favorites. But if I right click and I click add to quick favorites, I've added that to this custom menu that I can pull up with one hotkey. I'll show you that in operation right now. So to use your quick favorites menu, all you have to do is hit Q. There's my invert mask that I had. I don't have a lot shoved in there. I want this to be a pretty fast and quick thing. But what's nice is you can have a quick favorites menu for every mode. So right now I'm in sculpt mode, but if I hold tab and I go back over to object mode and I hit Q, my quick favorites is, I guess, not set up in object mode. But in edit mode, I hit Q, I should have some other options as well. So I need to set that up on my machine. Sometimes I do think I work on different machines, and sometimes I have the quick favorites enabled on one and not the other, and yeah. But if I come over here, mask, and I right click on there, I can add that to that menu. Now you'll notice that my sculpting had one other option that I typically like to include on that quick favorites. And I'm sure I'll eventually find more operations that I use a bunch to throw on there. Again, I don't like overcrowding it. I like to be very selective with what I put in there, but as you sculpt and you learn some of these operations, you're gonna develop your opinions about what should be on that list. So I come over here to sculpt. The other one I like is this set pivot to unmasked. And you can probably anticipate that this inverting the mask and then setting the pivot to the mask, like those are kind of related operations in the way I typically work with meshes. We'll explore exactly what I'm doing with that pretty soon when we get into masking. But for now, if you'll want to follow along, just right click here and add that to your quick favorites. And what you want to be doing is being able to hit Q and pull up those two options. Sound good? Cool. Now, we've got that set up. Let's check out some of these brushes. So I'm going to hit N to close that little menu there, right? So N closes that. Just like T closes the little menu here. I'm going to keep it open because it's tied to my screencast keys. So if I come over here, this is my menu button. And you can see I have some tabs. I can look at all of my options. I can click on General and just see some standard brushes. I can go to Add and Subtract, which are color-coded as blue brushes, typically. You'll have brushes here that typically add or remove. So if I start making a stroke, you can see that surface is rising out. And if I come up here and I hit this little minus button, I can take it in. So I'm carving in now. Now I typically leave it on that plus button, and then I hold Control to switch between them. So I'm still on plus, and then I hold Control, and I'm carving in. So I typically don't fuss with these things, but it's good to know that you have another option if you ever, for some reason, have a broken control key. But it's good to know that there's different ways to get to different things. So I'm gonna Command Z all of that. Command Z, of course, being the very standard undo function from a lot of creative software. Now, we've got a bunch of these brushes that live in Add and Subtract, and if I click around, you know, they've got a little picture that gives you some indication of what they might do. And some of them, especially with this low topology sphere, it's going to be a little bit unclear what they're doing. But you can gather from the name Add and Subtract, most of these are about manipulating the surface, pushing it in, and pulling it out, and they're all color-coded blue. Now we're going to get into specifics about what tools to use, but I wanted to cover the main groupings first. Another option here, I think contrast is a little bit of a strange name. These tend to be the smoothing operations. They don't all smooth, which is why there's an insistence on that. But if you hit S, that's the hotkey for this. This is the smooth brush, and essentially it's your eraser as a sculptor. Now, when I say your eraser, I'm using that very intentionally because a lot of times you don't necessarily want to be using this all the time. And a lot of times when we want to actually smooth things, and you'll notice this is actually kind of removing volume as it smooths, right? It's trying to reduce the amount of difference between form. That's kind of destructive sometimes. And a lot of times we want to, as sculptors, have a little bit more control over how our forms move and how we smooth between them and these sorts of operations. And so the one I want you to be using more often is this scrape fill brush. It looks right here. And what this does is it basically grabs a portion of whatever you click on first. It looks at where it is. And then as you paint out from it, it brings other objects in line with that a little bit, right? So you can see it's not quite a flattened brush, but it sort of does tend to grab things and have that effect. Now by default, what it's going to do is it's going to lower things to meet the level of whatever you clicked on in the center. So if I'm clicking on this square, everything around it's going to be kind of lowered to meet it, or kind of brought up to meet it a little bit. If I hold Control, I can actually raise the surface. So this sort of feels a little bit different than the smoothing brush, right? And it is messing with our form, right? But especially with pressure sensitivity, this starts to feel a little bit more like how you naturally would approach smoothing clay, right? You kind of like are rubbing your thumbs across it, kind of leveling out that surface. So you're scraping it, little things that are, you know, not quite at that surface, they're getting filled with the clay that you scrape across, right? So again, this has two modes. It has a carve and a hold Control, and you're kind of raising it up a little bit more, you know. It's worth noting that smooth also has two operations. There's obviously the smooth that we talked about, which is more of an eraser. If you hold Control with the smooth brush, it does this really funky thing where like things get really jittery. You need more geometry to really see this effect. We'll be talking about adding geometry in just a second. But here's the thing that I wanted to kind of cover with these brushes as I'm going through them. You'll notice that all of these smoothing brushes, flatten, you know, all these things that have to do with, you know, not necessarily adding or carving in, but more like sort of averaging and leveling and treating the surface. They're all color-coded red, right? And again, you want to use this scrape fill more often than smooth, so much so that it's worth giving it its own hotkey. Just like we did with quick favorites, we're going to right-click on that, and we're going to come down here and we're going to assign a shortcut. I'm going to remove my shortcut for now so I can have the same menu as you. Right-click, assign shortcut. Now in my sculpting workflow, I typically put this on the W key. The reason for that is I can just rest my hands there. I can hit Q to do my two favorite operations. I can hit W in order to switch to scrape fill. It's a useful way to use hotkeys, right? So again, when you're learning something like a Blender software, there's usually a lot of hotkeys, and then you add the complexity of being able to make and assign your own. There's a lot of power there, and I hope that you'll appreciate that flexibility. And I wanted to make sure that we covered that on the front end. Now, moving through, you might not have this texturing tab. I set that up. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. But there's this transform tab. These are color-coded yellow typically. And a lot of these have to do with just grabbing the thing and moving it around. So I'm going to hit G for grab. That's this brush right here. That's the hotkey for the grab brush. And I'm able to grab this and move it around. Boop, 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 boop. Boop, 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 boop. And you can see how this is conceptually different than the add subtract brush. It's not kind of pushing up and out from what's already there or carving into what's already there. I'm taking that silhouette, I'm really rearranging it, right? So there's quite a few of these. They all have different features. We're going to focus on a couple of key ones. Again, you'll find different uses for different brushes all over the place, but we're going to talk about the main ones that I end up using in this sort of intro to the brushes before we start sculpting. Yeah, so that's all of these brushes. I generally like to have all turned on, and you'll see the main ones are all kind of fitting in nicely at the ticker tape down here. I don't tend to touch a lot of these utility brushes or these ones that have the mesh icons. They're more set up for retopology. We will talk about that hopefully at some stage, but I don't tend to use them while I'm sculpting. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, hopefully. But I'll just leave it on all, and I just wanted you to kind of appreciate the color coding, right? It's a really, really useful feature. It's a lot of fun. Now, before I spend too long not addressing it, you've seen me do this a couple of times. If I hit F, I'm changing the size of my brush. And that's a really nice way to be able to really quickly address how you're affecting things, right? Now, our brush is set up to kind of smoothly have a fall off of effect. You can kind of come up here and check out some of these options. You'll notice that there's a fall off curves button. And if I wanted my sculpt, let's say I have a constant sculpt thing here, and I'm going to make my brush a certain size, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to grab the inflate brush, and I just start painting. It's going to have a very different feeling than something that has a smooth, oh sorry, it's by brush, so I'm going to move that to constant. That feels very different than this did, right? It's more, it's the same size brush, but it's a little bit on the larger side because there's not sort of this tapering of influence that happens. If you've ever worked with a brush in Photoshop, right? You can kind of imagine the center of the brush is the high point of the graph. And then as it approaches the edges of the cursor, it's kind of falling off. That's kind of what these curves represent. And you know, you can build your own custom one. So if I wanted to have a really, really unique curve, right, that spiked here and then went down, spiked here and went down, I could do that and get some really, really strange effects, right? Not exactly the best example, but it is worth knowing that these things do exist. A lot of times we're going to leave fall off on smooth. That's typically what we want. We don't always want to be noticing these things. But it's worth knowing that you can change the size of the fall off relative to the size of the brush. So right now you can see I have two circles that are kind of interlocked, right? There's the larger circle, and then there's the inner circle that's a little thinner. If I hit Shift and F, I'm able to kind of change how that fall off is approached. So I am using a smooth fall off, but I'm kind of changing where that fall off starts to take place. And so I made the influence of this brush a little bit bigger by hitting Shift F. It's still smooth, although it has less of an off ramp for that smoothing, right? Because of that. If I Shift F and I make this really, really tiny, I'm barely influencing anything, right? I am still doing a little bit, but it's just not quite the same brush as it was. So that's something that you can play with. F and Shift F. They both shape your brush without you having to do too much. And again, I'm moving this around by clicking that middle mouse button that I have on my pen. Cool. So I would encourage you to check out some of these things. Of course, along with a fall off curve, you have the global sort of strength. So right now, no matter what, with my brush, my inflate brush that I have currently, I'll never be able, no matter how hard I press, to do more than 0.35 influence. If I crank this all the way up, you're going to see very quickly I'm making bigger changes with that brush than I was. I was able to kind of sneak up on subtle effects by keeping it on the lower side. And what's nice is I don't have to be so worried about this just like running off if I have it low. So I have it pretty high right now. Because I am on a pressure sensitive tool, I'm not working with a mouse that only has one pressure sensitivity maximum. I can come in here and I can lightly touch this. And even though my strength setting is 1, you can see in some areas I can move it a little bit less than I would with a 1. I'm very light here. That's different than, right? Um, it's sort of a feeling thing. And again, this is just setting the maximum. So if you come over here and I'm going to reset that to the default value of 0.35, I think it was. You know, now no one stroke is going to be stronger than 0.35 no matter how hard I press. So that's kind of how that works. It's sort of an upper threshold, but you can always go lighter with your touches. Again, with sculpting, you know, depending on what you're doing, what operation you're doing, you might play with that influence at times. Now, there's a lot of different brush settings. We're going to be talking about these a little bit more in depth as we go. Texture is something we're going to explicitly cover when we get into tertiary level detail. Some stroke operations. If you're doing something that's really, really delicate and you're used to something like maybe Procreate that has some sort of smooth stroke on, you can always come in here and stabilize your stroke, and that gives you a little bit of a leash that you can drag around, and that sort of changes how the brush operation works. There's a hotkey for that. I believe it's Shift S. That turns that on and off. So, but it's worth knowing. I used to accidentally hit Shift S all the time when I was sculpting for some reason, when I didn't need it. So that is a hotkey that I learned through trial and error. But it's a useful thing, especially when you're trying to do really, really detail-oriented sculpting lines. We talked about fall off. We talked a little bit about cursor. We could display the cursor or not. I don't typically touch this too much. Because I like the default color coding. I like the blue of my cursor. I always think it's worth seeing where my cursor is. I don't really like having to guess. Some people do prefer, you know, to have that sort of direct connection with the mesh, I guess, but not this one. There's a couple of other options if you keep going right along this little banner, and you'll notice I'm starting by introducing a lot of these sort of different menu areas. This is where the functionality lives, right? This is your workspace, but this is where the functionality lives. Now, if I come over here, you can see there's a number of different options. There's X, symmetry, so you can see, and I'm gonna tab out. I'm gonna delete this little sphere, and I'm gonna add another one, just so I can have kind of a blank slate. Again, all I did was hold tab there, go to object mode, X to delete, Shift A to add a new one, and then I'm back. Boom. But if I turn this X operation on, you can see as I move my mouse around at certain camera angles, you can see there's almost like a line of symmetry that exists now that I'm being duplicated over, right? And as you can imagine, if I add the Y, there's another line of symmetry that's being duplicated over. If I add a Z, heck, I could be making marks that are radial symmetric along all of the axes, right? Typically we will, depending on what you're sculpting, if you have an object that you're sculpting that has natural symmetry, like someone's face, you will try to sculpt as long as you can with the axes of symmetry turned on, because it cuts your work down in half. And then a lot of people will make a very active decision to break symmetry at a certain point. It's really just purely a time-saving thing. There's no reason if you can sculpt one half of a face, you can't sculpt the other half of the face. And a lot of times you'll achieve more naturalism if you do. But it can be a production time saver if you're in the mood for that. We're going to be doing rocks, which is highly asymmetric, so we won't necessarily be touching these symmetry tools, but it's worth knowing that they exist. So there you go. And then these next three, they behoove a little bit more explanation. Now there's this thing called dynamic topology, and something you might have noticed is that as we're sculpting this stuff, and I am going to get rid of this real quick, this little line I drew. As we're sculpting this stuff, those squares, the topology that the actual mesh is made out of, have become extremely visible. Now, there's a couple of ways of resolving this in Blender. And dynamic topology used to be a halfway decent way to do it, right? it is giving us a bit of a warning here, turning this on. It's warning that dynamic topology will not preserve colors, it will not preserve UVs, and will not preserve any other attributes of the mesh. Now, if you're not interested in geometry nodes, the other attributes, you might be going, what's that? But hopefully you've encountered the idea that you can store texture information in vertices that are encoded through UVs, the coordinates that are attached to the mesh vertices, and that vertices can also store colors inside them, right? In fact, there's a whole mode devoted to vertex color. If you go to vertex paint and you click on this and you go and you paint, oh, it's blue here, right? And then I come back over here to sculpt mode and I turn dynamic topology back on, it's going to delete those vertex colors. So the next time I go to vertex paint, after I've sculpted with my dynamic topology turned on, I actually do need to make a mark here. And I go back to vertex paint, my blue paint's gone, right? Now, it's worth understanding the reason for this. What dynamic topology is doing is it is literally adding new geometry as we make our marks. And you'll notice that suddenly that surface started to look very different. I'm going to go over here to this overlays panel. I'm going to click on it and I'm going to turn wireframe on. And you can actually see now the geometry that's making this up. Now there's other areas where I had really, really thick, large squares showing up. You can see I only have 2 triangles right there. But with this new dynamic topology, if I turn it back on, and you'll notice it turns off every time I leave sculpt mode. This really is meant to be the quick and dirty version. And I'm sculpting. It's procedurally adding more and more geometry in those areas where I make a mark. And one of the reasons this is a little bit messy is because it's really inconsistent with how it spaces that geometry out, right? I can still have areas that are really, really faceted, and I actually have to touch them with the brush in order to add more geometry there, right? And at least in the old workflows, this is something you do quite a bit with, right? You'd go in maybe with a smooth brush and you'd touch everything that you had gotten perfectly lined up, and it maybe move everything, but you can maybe come in here and just like dot it with a C brush or a clay strip brush and smooth back out. And this is how you'd approach like better topology. We don't really sculpt this way anymore. Dynamic topology is something that is still around because it's sometimes really, really useful and people do like it. As a sculptor, I don't personally use it a whole bunch. It can be really, really nice when paired with this brush, the snake hook brush, because it's basically set up to add more geometry, and the snake hook brush is set up to give us big changes, right? And you can see how that's kind of pairing really nicely with that effect. Again, snake hook brush, that's yellow, it's something that really, really works nicely with dynamic topology turned on. It works less nicely with the other method, the remesh method, which is something we're going to explicitly cover. But this is essentially just subdividing the mesh wherever your stroke happens to hit it. That's all it's doing. If you have a mesh that's relying on a lot of different data and things, it can be kind of a problem to work this way. But it's worth knowing about. Now, before I introduce the method I actually want you to be using, I'm going to make you wait a little bit longer. There's one more thing I have to say. I'm going to turn typology off, or the wireframe off here. And that's just something I want to really, really point out. If I come over here to layout, you'll notice that my sphere looks a little bit different than when I'm in sculpt mode. It's not as pronounced of a difference as I would like right now. We'll talk about why that is. But it is there. And one of the things that, that invisible change that we have when we're kind of clicking on these workspace buttons, one of the things that does for me is it actually comes in and affects the way I'm lighting my mesh. Now, if I come over here and click on this little drop down that's next to our rendering modes, you'll know, wireframe, regular, shaded, lit. If I come over here to the regular blend mode that I'm currently in, and I click on this drop down, You'll notice the big change that I'm talking about is, by default, everything's lit with studio lighting. But in sculpt mode, we want to move into matte caps. Matte caps are these nice little lighting algorithms, and you can click on this little button here, and there's all these different flavors. And really what these are set up to do is they're set up to sort of fake lighting so that you can see your surface under different lighting conditions. And some of them are a little on the funkier side, right? A little toon shader. But really what they're set up to do is allow you to see your form, right? We talked about this idea that value changes are how we see form. And so we actually need light in order to see the form. And being able to look at your mesh under different lighting and material conditions will allow you to understand what you're actually manipulating and see your form a little bit better. I tend to like to work with this little rough clay or this sort of shinier clay turned on, but I will periodically be jumping around a little bit. I would encourage you to find one that you find useful. I would discourage you from doing something a little bit too crazy, the normal or the curvature node, right? These are set up for very specific issues. I mean, have fun, look at your mesh however you want, but when you're working, have something that makes sure that you can actually see value. Sound good? Cool. So, all right. We've covered a lot already, and this has been mostly set up. So what I'm about to dive into now is really more to do with how I want you to be working. And before I really talk too much about this, or I don't want to wait too much longer, it's worth understanding like one of the major workflows in the Blender interface. If we come over here, I mentioned dynamic topology is kind of not an ideal way to sculpt most things unless you're doing something with a snake hook. If you come over here, there's this button called Remesh. And if you click on that, you'll see there's a couple of options here. There's voxel size that you can set, and then there's a big old Remesh button here. And I would encourage you to just go ahead and try and hit that Remesh button. Boom. All right, so it's obviously something that's changed on our surface, right? The squares got smaller, right? We got finer topology. If I come over here and I turn that topology visualizer on that I have, so I click on this, I go wireframe, you can see, oh, okay, it's not really triangles anymore. There's like, it's all quads, you know, and that there's like 4 points to each face. And there's these kind of concentric, they almost look like topographic maps. What's going on here? Well, if I come down here to the Object Properties panel and turn on the Viewport Display, and I turn on Bounds, I can visualize for you the bounding box of this object. Now this is a piece of data that's attached to most mesh files, and essentially it's a box that includes the maximum and the minimum parts of the mesh, right? It's used for all sorts of operations in 3D graphics, including, you know, culling operations. So like if I wanted to test whether or not this was visible to a camera, a really great way to roughly test if this is in front of a camera or not would be like, hey, do any points of its bounding box show up, right? Within some set of bounds. So this is a really useful operation or a piece of data, and Remesh makes explicit use of this. Now, I can work with Remesh like this, of course. I can change this number and make it smaller or larger and get different results by hitting that Remesh. But if I learn the hotkeys for Remesh, I'm able to actually get better, more visual information as I'm sculpting. Like I'm kind of guessing with these numbers right here. And I'd rather be able to see how big or small my topology is going to become. If I hit the hotkey R, and this is the big one, you'll notice that I get this plane of mesh grid, and it's actually displaying on the face of my bounding box. And I can move my mouse cursor left to make that more coarse. I can move it right to make it finer. And I can go so fine that I cannot see it anymore. But I'm gonna move it around and make it kind of fine. So I'm actually gonna make it pretty dense right now, just for demo purposes. And I click and nothing happens. What I've effectively done is I've changed that size right here. And all I did was hit R to do that. and then move my mouse and then click to select. If I hit Control R, that's the same thing as hitting this remesh button. And what that's going to do is it's going to take the different parts of this mesh and make little cubes called voxels, and it's going to flood this bounding box with these cubes. Now, voxels are basically pixels with volume, and the idea here is that we just have a bunch of these that are flooding this cube, this bounding box, and wherever they find the mesh, they're going to do an operation, right? So you'll notice that there's quite a few areas, like up here, this top corner, where those voxels are not going to hit anything. But once it starts hitting that surface, it's going to start creating a signed distance field, and then they're going to do some other operations on it. I believe that Blender uses something called dual contouring. It's all on the more technical side. It's not stuff that you necessarily need to know. But essentially, they're going to remake this mesh in order to generate a new topology of this mesh, right? Now, because of this operation where it's looking for, okay, well, I'm coming in, I'm looking for areas without, and then I'm looking for areas with, those areas need to be pretty well defined. So one of the constraints, and I'm going to turn bounding box off for now, one of the constraints is if I grab a bunch of faces, let's say I'm in edit mode right now. If I grab a bunch of faces here and I hit X and I delete those faces, such that there is a hole now in our sphere, and I am going to turn backface culling off or on so that you can see that a little bit better. So you'll notice that there's a hole I punched in my sphere. Because of the way this operation works, where it's taking all of these little cubes and it's flooding this box and it's looking for where's my surface, where am I inside, where am I outside of the surface. If there is an opening where that can get in and it loses that definition of inside and outside, in other words, if it's no longer a watertight mesh, the operation is going to fail. And if I hit Control R here, you can see it fails in a very distinct way, right? So if you do wind up with meshes that look like this, it's likely because you have a hole somewhere in your mesh and you've got to find a way to close it. There's a bunch of cleanup operations in Blender that will help you do that. I'm not going to linger on that too long, but it's good to recognize that this result is entirely defined by having a remesh operation operate on something that doesn't have a clearly defined inside and outside, right? It needs to be watertight. Now, if I, was, in a position, let me get rid of my notes here. I'm going to delete this for a second. I'm going to hit Shift A. I'm going to add in a cylinder. And I'm going to come in here and I'm going to hit edit. I'm going to grab the top face of this. Let's say I was making a cup. And I really want this cup to work. It's going to look great. It just doesn't have a top face. I'm kind of naively thinking like, okay, well, I'm going to sculpt this cup. I'm going to hit Command R or Control R. And I'm getting frustrated because it's failing, right? There are ways to take geometry like this and make it watertight very easily. And I just thought I'd highlight this for a second because this has saved me a couple of times. Although you can get on them, this can get a little messy if you're not careful. If you come over here to the modifiers panel, we're not going to linger on this too long. There's a lot of great functionality here in Blender. But if you come over here to the generate panel and you look for something called solidify, essentially what this is going to do is it's going to give you a little slider that allows you to set a thickness to go extruding in or extruding out from this. So if I wanted to make this a cup, I might cut that off. I might solidify it. And then I might come in here and apply that modifier. So I have that geometry there that I can then sculpt. So just worth noting that that is something worth doing. Now you'll notice some of these edges got a little beat up, right? Again, I want to remind you that it's literally flooding this stuff with squares. The finer those squares, the more likely they are to be able to adhere to curvature. But it's going to always be a little bit of a cleanup operation around edges like that because of the nature of the algorithm. All right, I'm gonna go back to my sphere and talk a little bit more about practical use case. So we've got a wonderful little sphere here, and how do you actually start sculpting, right? How do you put all of this together? There's a lot I've thrown at you. Heck, there's a bunch of stuff here I haven't even touched, like this line project node where you can draw a line and cut off parts of your mesh, right? And the angle that you do it at, you know, does this stuff. And heck, I haven't even talked about box trim. You know, if I come over here and I grab a little, draw a little bounding box and I carve a little hole in there, right? If I right click on this, or sorry, click on the little drop down arrow, or being a little finicky right now. Okay, come on. Okay, sorry, it's click and hold. Apologies. I usually do this with a mouse, so I'm not, I'm doing it with my pen right now. I can also define non-bounding box thing with a lasso trim. This is extremely useful if you need to have organic holes in your mesh, right? It's wonderful. I can do that, and then I can do a remesh operation. You'll notice that it is a closed mesh still. Boom, remesh. You'll notice that there's a different color here. We'll talk more about that when we get into masking and face sets. But it's worth knowing that that's done automatically. If you need to hide that, you can come over here and you can come over here and turn face sets off. Or you can come here to face sets and do face sets from visible, making it all one face set. Again, I will be explaining that concept and face sets in a little bit, but suffice it to say, there's tons of tools. We haven't really talked about how to put them together and how to use them. But I do want to talk about workflow in a general sense before we really dive into the tools. So you've obviously got a bunch of brushes, you've got a bunch of operations, you're starting with some base mesh. A lot of sculpts will start with simple geometry. If you have like something that's already a little bit close to like what you end up looking for, that's just a little bit less work you have to do. So if you want to go through the process of box modeling something, you can. Box modeling, of course, is working with geometry in the way you've probably been introduced to, you know, in edit mode. But what we're going to be doing here, for the most part, is we're going to be doing operations like this, where we're, you know, moving things around and we're kind of seeking big, large shapes, and I must have left that on constant. Oops. Kind of looked cool. You know, you're making big changes, and you'll notice, even though I've maybe done a remesh operation on this, like my geometry is starting to get a little bit torn up. It's weird and jagged in places. Some of these faces have gotten a little bit on the long side, right? It's not ideal. So it's worth noting that the remesh operation, for whatever resolution you end up working with, doesn't have to be just run once and then forgotten. Basically, anytime you make big changes to a mesh, you want to be running a remesh operation on it real quickly. So boop, I'm just adding more geometry back in so I can continue working, right? And now, it's such that you typically want to build primary shapes, and then you might work at a certain resolution while you do this, and then you know, you might start really coarse to get really big primary shapes in, and then drop down a little bit to get smaller primary shapes in, and then you're going to do secondary shapes. What do you think you do there? How do you get to those smaller pieces of information? So you take this and you make it finer, right? And then you start doing secondary information. And then there's tertiary. You know, those pores and things that we were talking about. And your expectation might be that you go all the way to fine and you maximize how fine you can get. And so I just ran that operation. It took a little bit longer because it was adding a lot of geometry. You'll notice if I smooth this out now, I'm able to get nice, really buttery results. And come in here and, you know, if I have a carve brush or a crease brush, Shift C, by the way, is the hotkey for that. And I wanted to kind of carve something in. Maybe I want the sharp version. Hello. The thing that you're doing here is you're just throwing tons of geometry at this, and it works for the most part, right? But if you look at the topology, I'm going to come over here, turn it on, and I start zooming in. You're going to notice it still has those topographic rings, and those can kind of leave artifacts at times. It's just, again, a nature of the algorithm, the way it works. And it's also just like really, really, really dense. And we don't have a lot of control over that density and how it's working. And so when you start doing things like adding pores and fine detail, oftentimes we will break away from how we've been solving the problem up till now. So a lot of times what we'll do is we'll try to accomplish as much as we can here with the remesh operation. And then typically we're going to move into a different workflow for tertiary. We're still going to do everything in sculpt mode, but we'll typically move into a multi-res modifier workflow. Those right here under the modifiers. We'll talk more about that when we get there. But it does mean that there needs to be a step in between this and the multi-res. Oop. Right? Because this topology with its little rings, it's not really super well set up for the multi-res modifier. Ideally, we'd have topology that more or less maps onto the shape of our object. A little bit like that sort of faceting thing. So it's worth realizing that whatever you end up doing here at this stage with the remesh, you maybe don't necessarily want to go too fine with it, right? You want to maybe get the primary and the secondary shapes done, then do a retopology. Which is a manual operation in Blender. There are retopology tools that make things faster, and there's extensions that I'll be showing you, sort of the Blender way of doing some retopology. And then once you do a retopology, you're going to move into the multi-res, right? And that will allow you to add much more geometry than you ever could with the remesh. Geometry that's going to respect an underlying topology, and you won't expect to get these sort of topographic rings, right? And you'll be able to do things with the noise and stuff that you put on a brush that gets you close to like pores. So we're going to be covering that, but it's worth knowing that our first stage is going to be primarily concerned with getting our primary set up, and then our secondaries are going to come next. And then our tertiaries are going to happen after a retopology stage. So this is the typical way that we move through a sculpture in Blender. And I look forward to sharing the rest of this process with you. At the risk of making this video too long as an introduction, I am going to end it here and see you in the next part. Thank you.